Hello and welcome to the Dank Christian Memes podcast. My name is Broclen. I am one of the moderators at Dank Christian Memes, as well as the digital minister, and I'm joined by my partner in crime here, and I sometimes call him my better half, our resident archaeologist, Jacob. How have you been, Jacob?
Hello, I'm doing pretty well. I've got instant noodles, so I'm definitely set up for tonight.
All right, that's our plan. Well, we're very thankful to have you with us. We know that you have a lot of demands on your time. Edo Quinn is here. Hi, Edo Quinn. You want to introduce yourself a little bit?
Hello. I am an overly online individual as well, although I've also been preoccupied with things taking my time away. I've not been as online as I used to be this week, but I do various things at art/Edo Quinn, and I guess I'm like a potent pontificator. That's kind of like my main vein, just speaking out loud, thinking out loud.
I'm not sure what it means, but I like the alliteration, which I think is why alliteration works so well.
So a pontificator is just someone who like talks publicly about like whatever, like social issues and whatnot. So that would be, the way I've been described by others, and I've just kind of like leaned into it more recently.
Yeah, I feel like the social internet really encourages us to, pontificate, to muse on things and to share that and see how people react to it, whether positive or negative. We also have with us Cruel Angel. It's nice to see you. You've been sort of in and out. Are you doing well? We haven't heard from you all that much.
Oh, hi. I just had a lot of stuff going on. I've since joined kind of another 2 bands, and we're now practicing 4 days a week. So I'm keeping very busy.
And you retain the title resident musician, so even more so.
Yeah. Well, it's weird because like I had no intention to get in any more bands, but like I was at a jam session a few weeks ago, kind of got playing some like Hendrix songs with a couple people, and they were like, "Oh, you should come jam with us." And so I did, and I was like, "Oh wow, we're thinking about starting like kind of 60s rock trio thing." I'm like, "Oh yeah, okay." And I thought they were just like, tell us about it, because we musicians are terrible people. We like to brag about shit. So
I mean, you're sort of required to, right? If you want to get attention, you gotta be willing to sort of sell yourself. I mean, not sell yourself. Well, you know what I mean. Market yourself.
Yeah. I mean, we are the prostitutes of the airwaves.
That wasn't what I meant.
No, I mean, that's exactly what we are. That is precisely what we are. But I didn't realize at that point they were a duo, and they were looking at me to make the trio. So I've been learning the most ridiculous amount of like 60s alt rock songs, dude. And I just got to put this out there. I am bored of the fucking Beatles.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a matter of too much of anything is maybe not as good as you might have hoped.
I wasn't exactly a fan of Beatles in the first place. I've always been more a Stones kind of guy. So,
yeah, for me, it's just like, take a break and then come back to that particular time period in music. And I find it much more agreeable. Whereas some folks, that's where they live. That's always what they want to hear. So,
yeah. Well, I'm hoping we can go a bit more into the 70s as well, so I can play some like Clapton kind of Cream era stuff. But yeah, I've been pretty busy with that. I'm sorry I haven't much been around, but things have been pretty chaotic. So,
well, I know you're busy, and I know you're making an effort, and we're thankful for all our co-hosts and come on and join us from the start here. Today's subject is banned books and forbidden knowledge. And I thought that me and Jacob would come at this from a sort of historical perspective. Jacob, do you want to go first with an example, or should I open with with my example of a sort of a banned book that was considered dangerous or to contain forbidden knowledge?
Oh, either one. I have a very fun example right here, but I trust you do as well. So,
all right. Well, I don't. If yours is fun, then I don't want to go after that. So I'll set the tone with mine,
all right.
and then you can knock it out of the park with yours. Sound good?
Sounds good.
All right. So a lot of people don't realize this, but there was a period of time before the Bible was, the word is canonized, which before all the books of the Bible were put together, and then everyone was like, okay, this is what Christians should in general be reading and be studying. Now we know that there's, a few differences, I think, between Protestant and Catholic Bibles, and of course translationary differences. But by and large, the four Gospels are the ones that most Christians are attached to and interested in. But there were others, and so there was a time period where a bishop by the name of Irenaeus was writing about various heresies, because isn't it interesting that Christian history often revolves around heresies in some way or another. But he was very set against Gnostics and other types. And he mentioned that there was a Gospel of Judas that was particularly bad and should be done away with. Now, we don't know to what extent people just, threw these away, or I can't imagine people having public burnings, because I don't think Christianity was, sort of public in the same way during this time period. But so we knew that there was a Gospel of Judas only because someone had taken the time to say this is bad and we should get rid of it. So I forget what year it was, in the 1970s. There was a scroll called the Codex of Tachos. Are you familiar with this one, Jacob? Do you know how to properly pronounce that name?
If you showed me the word and told me what language it is, maybe.
No, I refuse. Well, I like to call it the Codex of Tacos, and I think it makes my story more fun. So that's what I'm going to call it until a more wise person says, hey, here's the language, here's what it's actually called. But it is a single copy of the Gospel according to Judas in a dialect of, I think, Coptic. And it is something that was really not cared for well. So, this guy Irenaeus wanted to do everything he could to destroy this thing. But the person who had the codex, the person who had the actual physical copy that was found in, I believe, the 1970s, was also not caring for it. So it's almost like in their inaction, they did more to hurt this gospel than Irenaeus ever could have by, railing against it and writing about it. And one of the big problems with it is it is incomplete. But it presents a picture of Judas that is sympathetic. And I think that there's a lot of Christians out there that are like, well, isn't it kind of an inside job? Because, God, this was kind of part of the grand plan, and that Judas sort of played a role in that grand plan. Have you guys ever heard Christians sort of talk about Judas in a more sympathetic way, that like maybe he was just doing what somebody needed to do? Or is that just something I've heard tossed around my particular seminary circles?
I grew up hearing it, and I think I was pretty sold on it as a kid, to be honest, because you hear, like, if Jesus knew everything about his ultimate fate and the afterwards as well, I suppose, because it's not really the ultimate fate, then he knew who he was picking as disciples, and that Judas would be the figure.
Well, and also, I can't remember which of the Gospels he says it in, but at least one of them, he says, Judas, do what you came to do. Like that it's Jesus pretty much not endorses, but says, do the thing. So it does sort of, I think there's a number of Christians for whom that kind of makes sense. And I know that there's a lot of traditions who do not see Judas particularly well. And that also makes sense. I think it depends on, what your theological focus is.
Dante puts him at the very bottom of hell, getting chewed on by Satan forever. So he definitely has this.
Right.
There's factors.
Yeah. So I think the sympathetic view of Judas is like the hook. And I think that this has become a little more popular since I did my study on this little codex and the gospel itself. I think you can now find translations of it online relatively easily without having to dig into a seminary library or anything weird like that. But the other thing is that we are presented with an entirely different cosmology and an entirely different God. That the God that we worship, the God we might call Yahweh or Elohim or Jehovah, that God is repudiated as a lesser God, and we're introduced to a number of deities, many of which have connections to, Egyptian deities, because that's sort of the region of the world that this gospel was written in. So, while it might seem like a nice gospel at first, when you get into it, you're like, oh, we're not worshiping the same God here. We're looking at something very different. And it's actually a more of a, I don't want to say pantheon, but it is, there are higher and lower deities of various forms. So it is sort of a polytheistic structure. But what's most disappointing about it is when the ultimate deity, whatever their version of the Most High is, speaks, it is destroyed. We have no idea what the ending was, what their God would have said when they spoke from, this sort of cloud that descended on people at the end. So again, between Irenaeus condemning it and between, someone else just not caring for it in storage, we don't know the climactic ending or what this deity might have said or what their interests or values might have been. So it is ultimately a big disappointment, but I think it also, speaks to a lot. Like, there are other gospels out there, and for various reasons, they are not the ones that sort of rose to the top. Is that consistent with your sort of understanding of the sort of pre-canonical Christian period, Jacob?
Yeah, because
am I just making stories up here now?
No. I think you're right. One of the things that characterizes the early canonization process of the New Testament is that there's no central authority for Christianity. There's communities and there's influencers.
It's sort of egalitarian in that way.
It's
sort of,
decentralized.
We still have to depend on scribes. So
yeah, and you also have people who are large personalities. Paul is a great early example of a widespread influential personality that we can read a lot about. But a lot of the time, when there's no specific person who can decide what every community is using, what ends up being happening is this sort of process of democratization where the sources that are used widely across these communities are going to be the ones that end up with the highest prestige, because they can be cited between one community to the next.
And I think that this gospel, the gospel of Judas, was really a product of its particular place. Yeah. And I think that's particular, cosmology and, layout of their divinity. It seemed like it was particular to, I've heard historians use the word mystery religions or secret religions. Have you heard that term used, or is that?
Yeah. So I think there's two relevant things here. There's mystery religion and there's Gnosticism. Mystery religion is a term, we often use the term mystery cult, cult not in the sense of Rajneeshpuram and Jonestown, but in the sense of a venerative practice around a specific deity. And these are cults that would have some sort of initiation ritual and insider knowledge and practice for a specific group of people within the ancient Mediterranean world. And so you have those for
I compare them to our modern day conspiracies in a lot of ways, that by holding this secret knowledge, by knowing that, the president is a lizard person or whatever it is, that you are in some way supposed to be transcendent. So, I got the impression that whatever the deity was trying to say at the end was sort of the secret knowledge that would have been the focus of that community.
Often, yeah. I think it's hard to sum them up because it's kind of an artificial category that we're impressing on this world of decentralized religion, right? And the same goes for Gnosticism, which describes a Christian movement that I believe the Gospel of Judas is representative of, that is similar in a lot of ways. And Gnosticism's basic premise from gnosis in Greek, which is knowledge, is that salvation is attained through achieving secret knowledge, and that Jesus was essentially the ultimate Gnostic, the ultimate figure who could access this bridge between the transcendent and our plane. And this division in Gnosticism is generally, it's an artificial category put on it by largely detractors of the ideology.
Well, but there are fans. There are fans of Gnosticism.
Yeah.
Or at least, what they've seen or what they like. I imagine they, sort of a la carte, rather than saying, oh, yes, all these Gnostic books are for me 100%. But I've also heard, ministers rail against it as sort of a denial of the physical world, that, God made humans and human bodies and the world and declared that they were good. Whereas Gnosticism usually says only the spirit matters and the physical world is sort of a distraction at best and a delusion at worst, or something along those lines, varying between community, of course.
Yeah, the generalized version that we get generally when we discuss Gnosticism, once again, it's not a centralized, just like more mainstream versions of Christianity, it is not centralized in this early period by any authority, so it does have variation. But the generalized version is that there is like a higher deity and a lower deity. And the lower deity is called the demiurge, who created the physical world, the imperfect world. And this is actually a false deity. And then there's the higher almighty who created the spiritual reality that is pure and worth reaching out to. And so that's like the fundamental argument of Gnosticism, really.
Yeah, well, and I think that, I don't want to absorb too much of the conversation here, but I think since we've talked a little bit how the term Dead Sea Scroll is sort of a made-up term, especially for good media attention around certain archaeological finds. But would you mind saying a little bit on the Nag Hammadi library? Because I imagine what you would say would be more eloquent than what I would come up with.
Yeah, so the Nag Hammadi library is sort of a collection of texts that was found in Egypt in the middle of the last century. I think it's 13.
Is it one particular site or a collection of
Nag
sites?
Hammadi is the name of the site it's found at. And they are basically a set of codices that comprise one of the most complete collections of Gnostic texts we have, because Christian communities eventually would come to look down on these texts more and more. And so what the Nag Hammadi library is just the term for a specific set of these that were found together that represent the views of a specific community. And so we can look at those and we can argue how much they represent like a mainstream for Gnosticism or if they represent this specific community. But regardless, they're a look into a Gnostic understanding of the world that is fairly useful archaeologically and historically.
Yeah, well, and I know when I was young, I picked myself up a collection of non-canonical gospels, And I thought they were really interesting and really neat. But eventually I started feeling bad because it was like, I should be reading the actual Bible though. Like that, this is an interesting historical thing to look at, really interesting cultural perspective. But at the end of the day, I was like, okay, I should get back to work. It's kind of a distraction.
Did you ever read the Infancy Gospel of Thomas while you were at it?
I don't know if that was in the collection. Is that yours? Because I don't want to give away the good parts. If that's where you're,
but it's
is that the one where Jesus, as a youth, pushes a boy off a roof?
Yes.
And everyone's like, "Oh my God, Jesus, what did you do?" And he's like, "No, he's fine. He's fine." And like he kind of does like a quick resurrection to sort of get out of trouble.
Yeah, the whole narrative is basically an arc for childhood Jesus learning to use his abilities right.
Is that also the one where
it's a fascinating text that you can imagine exactly why it became considered heretical. But if you want a wild ride of a non-canonical gospel, I recommend. It's not actually that long.
Is this also the one? Let me know if I'm confusing them. Where I think Joseph or someone like raises a hand to Jesus for like misbehaving, and Jesus like just rebukes the adult and like sends them away in shame or something like that. Or am I thinking of a different one?
I don't remember for sure. There is a teacher scene where they like send him to a teacher to learn the Greek alphabet. And
okay.
Jesus just like snaps and like explains it to the teacher. There's also a scene where he cripples a kid because his father accuses him of like performing miracles on the Sabbath. But the thing is, so all the people who get hurt, by the end of the gospel, he ends up like making up for them. So he like fixes all our problems. And that's kind of the arc, is it's like, how did Jesus become the perfect person he was?
Well, and we have a little piece of him potentially misbehaving. I don't know. So we have the story of Jesus and Mary and Joseph all traveling together from, I think it was Jerusalem. And they had assumed that Jesus was part of the caravan they were traveling in, and then couldn't find him and realized they left him back in the city. And when they found him, Jesus said, "Well, of course I'd be in my Father's house. Where else would I be?" And it's hard not to see that as like really, really snarky. Although I wouldn't leave Jerusalem without knowing for sure if my kid was with me. So, maybe there's maybe there's some shared fault going on in that story too.
It's interesting, I think, because it really gives the idea of, like, it's easy to read when we talk about like Christological discussions and like the discussion of the nature of Christ that existed in early church councils. In this world before these church councils, these questions of like who Jesus was are even more debated, right? And so in many
Christology
ways,
is pretty heavy
like
stuff.
Non-canonical gospels are the ultimate ways we can actually see the sides of the debate, the versions of Jesus that people imagined in these early communities. And I think the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, like, it strikes particularly hard because it is so different from the one we're used to. And that's one reason why it's so interesting and why it's one of my favorites, even though it's a really uncomfortable book, kind of, in a lot of ways.
I have to say, though, that the Trinity gets a lot of flack for being, a mystery and an explainable mystery or whatever. But compared to some of the descriptions of the cosmology and of divinity in some of these Gnostic texts, it makes the Trinity look comparatively tame. Maybe I'm the only one who sees it that way, but
I mean, I can understand that. To be honest, I've been kind of like in and out because I feel like I'm not entirely fit to be conversing in this discussion, but I can totally see what you're saying about like Gnosticism or, non-canon works feeling more strange or more out there than, even the more out there versions of the canon, Christianity. I mean, the Trinity, frankly, is something that I think is just not well understood by most people. And oftentimes the people who understand it the worst tend to sometimes, I won't say oftentimes, sometimes speak about it in the most definitive and incorrect ways. But that's, that's whole Dunning-Kruger of it all to some extent as well. I remember someone talking about like how, like Christianity is inherently polytheistic because the Trinity. It's like, that's not really how that works, but okay.
Well, and to a lot of people outside Christianity, to folks of the Jewish and Muslim faiths, that they're like, well, that looks a lot like polytheism to us, but that's none of our business, sort of.
That argument is actually made in the Quran itself. There is a passage that attempts to argue against the Trinity, which I do not remember offhand, but it's an interesting read if you want to get into this discussion from that angle as well, in another scripture.
Yeah, well, and I've had a Muslim student who I'd love to have on the podcast, but our schedules have just been all wrong. So I think sometime in the coming months, I'm going to have to prepare, and I'm going to have to stay up late for their benefit, so we can actually get a Muslim perspective on Jesus, because I think you're right. I think that's very, very similar, even if it's not necessarily something that you consider to be part of a Christian canon. But I want to put. So I have discussion questions. I want to come back to my boy Irenaeus and whether or not banning material was good, or if he just made us more interested in this document when we finally found it. But I know Jacob has more examples, so I don't want to undercut that.
So you want me to throw my example out here?
Yeah, throw some examples out, and then we'll come back to sort of this meta discussion of to what extent is banning books useful, in what circumstances might it be called for, that sort of thing.
So this is a different question than canonization, but rather from a much later period in the history of Christianity. I was going to bring up the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, which was a list of banned books in the Catholic Church that was used from the 1500s and actually was only abolished in 1966.
Wow.
Basically, the Catholic Church kept an index of books that they considered to be heretical or otherwise dangerous to the faith. And because this takes place in the early modern period, what we're talking about is obviously a lot of Protestant works, but more importantly, for sort of or I think more importantly for church history, it interestingly included a lot of scientific and philosophical texts that were considered problematic. One of the major issues, if you've ever read about the Galileo affair, where Galilei was supported by the Vatican, but he sort of got on the wrong side of the Pope after a while. And
yeah, I've heard some debate over whether or not it was his science that got him in trouble, or if you had just been straight up rude to the Pope, and that was the real issue.
Yeah, I don't think it was his. It was the Inquisition that didn't like the science. It was his attitude that sealed his fate, I think, about the whole situation. But anyway, in the wake of the Galileo affair, there was a problem around heliocentrism, and it is a contentious topic. The idea that the sun was orbited by the Earth rather than the other way around. And this idea, because it challenged the sort of cosmology in Genesis from a very literal standpoint, where you have the light that governs the day, it implies, the sun moves around the earth.
There were still a lot, and are still a lot of connections between God and the sun made, and that's there's a lot of different cultural reasons for that.
Yeah, but also like even frankly, to bring up flat earthers today, they often point to biblical cosmology, and that's it's understandable why it's there. It's because from standing on the ground, the sun does seem to move around you. Like it makes sense to describe it that way. We still describe sunrises and sunsets because that makes sense from our point of reference. But a lot of these astronomical works ended up on the index, including Kepler's Epitome Astronomiae Copernicanae.
Because it wasn't a book unless it was written in Latin at the time.
Yeah, which basically worked off of the Copernican model of the solar system. But also you have philosophers, especially of like early humanist and liberal movements, as well as some of the modern moral philosophers. For example, Immanuel Kant's Critique of Pure Reason was on there for a long time. Works of Voltaire. Philosophers who were critical of the church and traditional morality and knowledge-making systems that the church had cited. And so a lot of these texts were on there. The thing about its enforceability, though, was it was only really enforced legally within the papal states itself. Other versions of it would be used by like different Catholic powers, like Spain and the Holy Roman Empire, but the political ability of the church to like ban these texts across Europe was limited, especially as church power sort of waned over the course of the modern period in different places. Like obviously, these scientific discussions about heliocentrism happened, and even Catholic publications occurred with them. There are publications of Newton's Principia Mathematica, one of the principal works that helped establish modern physics, that include discussions by church figures who essentially carried out the publication, where they talk about heliocentrism and whatnot because they have to. You simply can't go into some of these topics without dealing with things on the list, and so the ability of the list to actually ban the circulation of these books across Europe was pretty limited.
So it's more like they were advising against it. And I got the impression that that was Bishop Irenaeus's situation as well, that he was trying to advise against these writings and these communities, but he didn't have literacy wasn't as widespread. So he was talking to, pretty specific group of people. And it's not like these books were found far and wide. So I don't think that there was like any book burnings or anything. I don't know if there's much evidence for. Well, would there be evidence if there were burning of Christian texts?
Yeah, we'd hear about. I mean, the thing about book burnings is they're kind of a newer concept. They do happen in the medieval period. There's a king of France, I forget which one, who had all the like Talmuds in France gathered up and burned in one of the largest medieval.
Ooh, that sounds like some serious anti-Semitism right there.
So like they happened, but I don't know if, or I do know of them in the ancient world. They're just on the wrong side of the world. The Qin dynasty supposedly cracked down on like Confucian and Taoist texts in China. I don't know about early Christian texts, but the thing about Christians, like in the time of Irenaeus, is that basically he didn't have actual political power. he was, he was a bishop with some influence and a lot of writing.
But it was mostly scholars and elites that he might have influenced, not communities worshiping necessarily.
Them, he didn't drive their hand. They decided whether or not to listen. With the Index Librorum Prohibitarum, in the more modern period, the church was an incredibly powerful political force, but modern statehood was already becoming a competing force that limited it, right? And so maybe you'll lose your nice, cozy church job for being a bit too into heliocentrism, but you're not going to stop the people in the universities who, are beyond the reach of the church. Frankly, the Enlightenment period often had notable figures critical of the church. That was one of the major movements of the time, one of the major rises in humanism and its branches like liberalism. But the very, very seldom was it the church itself that was the thing that cracked down on these people, because
largely because they didn't have the ability.
Yeah, by the last few centuries, kings were already trying to reduce the power of the church. You think of Louis XIV and the like. And so by the time the list was abolished, I would imagine that for a long time it had been functionally an advisory list. The Inquisition wasn't carrying out seizure of books and burning them in the 1960s.
Well, I mean, and I have to imagine that's probably for the best. So, like, going back to my boy Irenaeus over there, and I think you're right. Like, he was an influencer within a particular community, and that community, as is often the case even now, is somewhat separated from actual worshiping people or communities. But like, I kind of identify with him because the Gospel of Judas is very, very different, not so much because of Judas, but because of everything else. And that, if you're trying, I don't know if the Trinity was known to be a thing at this particular point in history, but, sort of trying to codify what Christianity is and what Christianity isn't. I can sort of identify with him saying, this one is just a little out there and not a good idea. On the other hand, your example is pretty perfect, that like getting worked up about scientific things, it seems like historically that this has mostly been academics talking to other academics, scribes to scribes, scholars to scholars. But now, because, literacy is so widespread, the idea of banning a book or burning a book, I feel like is a bit different. Jacob, how unique are we in our time period for literacy? Were there any other highly literate societies that, we're forgetting about?
When we talk about highly literate societies in the pre-modern world, like the ancient and medieval world, we're talking societies that were still behind societies we consider low literacy today, frankly. The fact is that before widespread printing, access to texts of any particular length was just not great unless you were fairly privileged. Even in societies that we consider high literacy, for example, the medieval caliphate, the Abbasid Caliphate had high literacy, partly because of the stress that Islam has historically put on studiousness and the ability to read things like the Quran. even then, if you like walked up to someone on the street, I doubt they would have the reading capacity that most children have in most countries today, simply because they just don't have the sheer access of works to practice with. And that's sort of what we should expect. Most of the time, in fact, I think maybe we could go with this analogy as a better analogy for how this process of canonization and text promotion or suppression worked is rather than thinking of it as keeping things in or out of the hands of the people, think of it how today we have wars between textbooks and writers of textbooks for school children, right? You have someone whose job it is to convey a certain set of information, and they have a set of books from which to do that from that determine what the information is. If there is an idea or set of ideas that run through a set of textbooks, we might be critical of education that relies or uses on those in a particular way. And it's the same thing with these ancient texts. Generally, when we argue about curricula, we aren't saying that ideas should be banned from public discourse altogether. We're saying that these ones should be the ones that are standardized for teaching use, and others should be shied away from because they are problematic in some way or another, whatever we consider that to mean. That's the same thing that's going on here with canonization.
Yes, yeah, and thank you for taking a moment to explain the canon. I sort of bumped up against it without really describing what it was or its significance. So we've covered a few examples. I want to try to bring Cruel Angel and Edoquin into the conversation a little bit. We live in somewhat of a unique time because literacy is pretty widespread, and we generally consider that to be a good thing. But with literacy comes, access to all sorts of information and knowledge. So we're talking about religion, we're talking about, fundamentals of science. I don't know if this is possible or not, but I would be alarmed if the information for making, say, nuclear weapons or biological weapons was just readily available on the internet. That would be alarming to me. But, maybe not shocking. So, is there a time and space for, sort of forbidding knowledge or access to certain things, or is it just an impractical exercise that doesn't really work? Edoquin or Cruel Angel, do either one of you want to weigh in?
Sure. I mean, I would say, I don't know if you guys are familiar with a internet streamer by the name of Destiny, or goes by the name of Destiny, but he was asked about this sort of in the vein of like cancellation, talking about controversial figures getting canceled on various platforms. And I think he made the point that cancellation works pretty well at taking certain public figures off the board, so to speak. It doesn't work as well at actually taking certain ideas off the board. So
yeah, that's a good distinction.
Yeah. So you could theoretically ban a book or prohibit certain speakers or certain words, but it would be difficult to prohibit entire strains of thought or sort of purge the internet, let's say, especially the internet, but the world more broadly, of entire strains of thought writ large.
Yeah, well, and I think back to World War II and the Nazis, and obviously the Nazi genocide against Jewish people and others, and their desire to burn Jewish texts, which is anything from Jewish religious texts to the writings of Albert Einstein or others. And I feel like at that time, maybe in an area that would be effective, right? But now, because the internet is so widespread, I feel like, if you're doing a book burning, that's I I don't know. We can mass produce books. Many of them are digitally available. I feel like maybe in that, city or in that town, they would be without those ideas, at least for a time. Whereas, there's always way to get information. I've come to believe that I don't think you can actually remove ideas, much like you said, that maybe there was a time, but I don't think it works anymore with the internet.
I would like to suggest a counterexample because I've got the Pachacudi profile pic, so I have to talk about indigenous American civilizations. Following the Spanish conquest of the Americas, in Mesoamerica and the Andes, there was a concerted effort to attempt to stamp out the local religion. But the Spanish colonizers tended to barely understand the systems of knowledge keeping that they were dealing with. And so they tended to indiscriminately burn codices in Mesoamerica and the quipu, the knotted string information keeping systems of the Andes in South America. And so we actually have you can count the number of extant Aztec codices on your fingers that exist. We have a lot of information based on the classical Nahuatl writing system that arose in the Spanish period, written in the Latin script. But as for original texts, we have next to nothing. And this is because of a very successful destruction campaign carried out by figures like Diego de Landa is one of the major organizers of it. And so this is a genuine problem when we're trying to reconstruct these cultures and their worldviews, because we tend to only have, for the most part, perspectives that are filtered through people who were either indigenous people who were partly Hispanicized and generally Christianized, writing about the traditions of people who weren't, right? Or you have the Spaniards themselves writing about these cultures, and we have to take, the sources we now have are through their lens. And so in this case, I think that there are historical situations where destruction has possibly significantly destroyed ideas to the point where the ideas that we do have in the leftovers are very hard to sort through and see how close they were to the ideas that actually existed beforehand.
Well, and yeah, I've taken a lot for granted in my statements, forgetting that, before we had a Rosetta Stone, we didn't know a lot about some ancient languages. And like you said, the Americans that were here before, Europe made its way over were obviously not well represented, to say the least. I should have known better, especially because did any of you guys see the latest episode of John Oliver's show Last Week Tonight, where he talked about museums and a lot of sort of stuff that you touched on here, Jacob?
I did see that, actually, yeah. Or rather, the YouTube upload part. I didn't watch the full episode.
Me as well. I'm not a premium subscriber or whatever. But I think one thing that stood out to me most is the metal plates that were like an epic story or an important history or something very important, and Europeans came in and grabbed them and lost the original order, and now they're completely isolated from the community that that's their history and their heritage. So in this case, they were very successful of just removing it, and now you have to come to a museum in Europe somewhere to actually see it, which is not where those people live or really have access to overall.
Well, I would say what you said, Jacob, is not necessarily counter to what Broclen said initially. He was talking about, going off of what I said, talking about how it's difficult to destroy ideas in the post-internet era. pre-internet era, obviously. Like there's all kinds of forbidden knowledge, lost knowledge. I mean, First Nations people is a more recent example, but just go back to the Greek Dark Ages, go back to the European Dark Ages. There's a lot of lost knowledge for sure. That we're not. I don't think anything that was said prior to when you jumped in was like running counter to that. It's just talking about how in the modern era, like I'm very much not in favor of banning things. If I need to say that, it should be implied from everything. You don't know me, but like it should be implied from like everything I've said so far, which is not much to be fair. I've been quiet, and everything that you could find out about me on the internet. I have much more of a like pluralistic and knowledge. I would say philosophical, lover of knowledge mindset. But like,
do you have a line? Like I mentioned, my line about like weapons creation and things like that.
I have a bunch of like little catchphrases I've been told, but it's nothing. It's more like Rick and Morty level stuff than like pithy and truly like insightful level stuff, if that makes sense. But my point just being, yes, knowledge is lost and has been lost historically, but in the modern era, which I think was what Broclen's prompt was, I took it anyway, was talking about, it's just much harder. So I don't think, for example, the full like how to make a nuclear device, a nuclear weapon specifically, kind of information is out there. I think you can say that much, but the basic ideas about like how these machines and weapons work is already like studied and scholastic to some extent. Even it's just like the specifics of actually like how do you make a nuclear bomb is still a guarded secret that certain nations have and certain nations claim to have, but maybe not, and certain nations clearly don't have and admit they don't have, and all the evidence points to them not having it. So that's an example of something that, yes, that is somewhat forbidden knowledge for sure. But for example, the red pill, whatever version of that you want to talk about, that's not forbidden knowledge. And it's forbidden knowledge in the sense that it's like considered unpopular or, whatever, hateful in certain circles, but it's not something that we can stamp out. We can try to suppress it, but we can't actually ban it because, again, you can ban the individual, but the idea will persist in the modern era anyway.
Yeah, and I think we're seeing a lot of that, in particular, sort of hateful ideologies that people thought were a thing of the past. And like, no, they're still here in some form or another. And sort of true to what you said, that idea persisted no matter how unpopular it may have seemed. It didn't quite go away. And many of the ideas we don't like wherever we are politically are not going anywhere. So it's challenging, but that's a sort of pluralistic perspective that we have here on the internet, at least. Cruel Angel, what do you think about this from a music perspective? I feel like there's plenty of Christian moms that have been like, well, I don't want my kids listening to rap, but I also don't want them listening to that evil metal music. Is that stuff just good for musicians? Does that just make their music more attractive to rebellious children?
Absolutely. Without a doubt, this is kind of how we had the whole satanic panic back in the 80s. It was a lot of usually very urban Americans that were very shouted, a lot of them Christian, being told they have to be this and they have to do that. They have to look, act, and perform a certain way. And, teenagers will be teenagers where, they're rebellious and loud and want to do fun things. And usually the most tempting thing to them is what's forbidden, You tell any teenager you can't do that, first thing they're going to think is, that is exactly what I want to do. Exactly. I mean, this is why we had the big scare along with things like Dungeons and Dragons that, lent into the whole mythology and demonistic kind of, the travel into that kind of realm, which led into the heavier music. They kind of went along with the fantasy. So it very much plays a part that, if you make something forbidden fruit, it's going to taste all the more better. Why wouldn't you chase it? You know, it's also, I don't know if you've seen back in the 80s when there was this big satanic panic, there was a big call to get a lot of censorship into modern rock music for the time. In fact, it went to court. It was kind of started by the Gore administration. And if you ever get to watch the videos on kind of all of that in court.
There was stuff against video games at that point too, right? I remember Mortal Kombat was held up as an example of vile video games that needed to be curtailed in some way. And some big name politicians were on that.
Later. Yeah, that was about 10 years later when we started to get a bit more realistic as far as, you know, things like graphics and gore and such. But it was very much prevalent in the 80s. But if you do get a chance to watch those videos, there is some fantastic footage of Dee Snider of Twisted Sister going into court. And I mean, the dude's wearing like ripped jeans and bloody band t-shirt, big, blonde, permed hair and all the makeup. And you look at this guy and you think, God, he's going to be thick as pig shit. But he goes in with far more decorum, and he absolutely blew everyone away because he just said, look, I'm not sure what you're getting at. I mean, I don't see whether there's a problem here with the values in the music. I mean, he was a father. He spoke about being a father and how it meant what it did to him and his family, and how these things can be ingested in a safe way. I mean, there's, you know, a lot of ways to enjoy different types of media. And if you try to shout at your kids from it, they're going to run further into it. You know, the more freedom you give them, the more they're going to explore, the less they're going to obsess.
Well, there's also that sort of backfire effect. It's like saying, don't think about elephants. Like it's in your head now. So I think that there's a lot of parents. I've been that parent. I've made that mistake. Be careful. Don't do this. No, it doesn't work that way.
Yeah. I mean, there's obviously times when you've got to do it for safety, but, you know, a human.
Right, but there's only so much control you have over your kid, even when they're young.
Yeah, of course. But, you know, you teach them right, you make sure they know, you know, they have a moral compass, and then, you know, they're sentient beings. They're going to go and make their own decisions, their own mistakes, and that's life, you know, that's how you learn. And as long as you don't punish them too much or, you know, give them too much crap about it, it should be okay.
So I want to come back to the issue of, you know, to what extent can we or can anyone successfully ban books, or is it useful to label content or ideas as forbidden knowledge? Jacob shared with us that sort of historical perspective where, well, you know, in some cases, yeah, we have lost, you know, entire civilizations worth of information in history. But in the modern age, we if it's on the internet, you know, if you write it down in a book somewhere, I guess it could be easily lost. But if you put it on the internet, it's much harder to stamp out that idea or even that post sometimes. So I want to give Sentient Gorilla and Crashing Ego an opportunity to share their opinion on to what extent you can or even, you know, should try to, you know, place things outside of bounds.
Hey, thanks for having me. I hope everyone's having a fabulous day. In my opinion, I kind of feel like a lot of things that are part of the modern conversation are being, I want to say that the reasoning that's given for our modern discourse, a good example is schools saying, oh, you know, don't like the Don't Say Gay bill, or banning books from libraries that happen to have LGBTQ stuff in there. And I'm not necessarily advocating for this stuff. I'm just saying that a lot of the times it seems to me that the whole notion of the school shouldn't tell the parents how to raise the kids. It's the parents' responsibility. I feel like a lot of that terminology is just a mouthpiece to get people to get behind it, but not really the real reason. It's just anti-LGBTQ. I think that when it comes to preventing certain knowledge, or even instilling specific morality or values in the youth, that responsibility comes down solely on the parents, and it is completely unacceptable for the parents to expect that the government has any right to assist or enforce any morality that you as a parent should be doing yourself. Other than that, I don't have a whole lot to add that could enlighten the situation or the conversation, but that's my position.
Yeah, there's a lot of discussion around schools, and I think, in public schools, at least, you just have this issue where, well, how many students do you have? How many parents do you have of those students? And how many differing perspectives on what should or shouldn't be in a library? That libraries aren't usually like held to a vote or anything. And if they were, I think that would be a pretty chaotic world. So yeah, it seems like it's gotten to be a bit of a competitive space for people. But like we said earlier, I don't think that banning things from a school library is gonna keep that idea is gonna carry on regardless. Crashing Ego, did you want to add your perspective here? I guess not right now at this particular moment. I'm going to bring Ashian on. So we're talking about, we've talked a little bit historically, and we're talking a little more modernly about, banning information or people trying to ban information, to what extent that's useful and to what extent it backfires and makes certain musicians more popular. Do you have anything you want to add to that, Ashian? See, your mic is off, but I cannot hear anything from you right now. Okay, and Crashing Ego's back with us. So we'll see if you guys can find your microphones.
Okay, so I think I have a somewhat interesting example of missing or lost information, how it pertains to the past and how it affects now.
All right.
And it does actually, and this is odd for me, have something of a religious connotation, which, I mean, that's severity. So I'll put it straight out there. I'm a Freemason. Now, a lot of Freemasonry is based on religious teachings, a lot of it Jewish. But what you may know about Freemasons is we are a society with secrets. We are not a secret society. There is quite the difference. But the example I'm referring to is historically, we did have real secrets of worth. They are the genuine secrets of a master mason. Now, back when
that's like trade secrets, basically, right?
Basically, yeah. So the grand architect, who was the one who constructed, or rather did the architectural work for the Temple of King Solomon, was a gentleman by the name of Harald Biff. Incredibly important to Freemasonry, like the top dog, dude. Now, he was murdered because he was told to give up the genuine secrets of a master mason, which at the time were a real big deal. Obviously, he just planned out a massive building for Solomon, and so everyone else wasn't exactly living in the kind of opulence that he was. It was kind of a big secret. So he was pursued for these secrets. He didn't talk, and so he was killed. So all of the genuine secrets of a master mason were lost with him. Now, obviously, we've made a society based on that. But since then, we have had to have we've had to create our own secrets. They're kind of like, I think it was like, I don't know, fill-in secrets, you know? Because they're not the real thing, but they're just like a placeholder.
Well,
Now,
and there is this, we talked about conspiracy theories a little earlier. There is this persistent conspiracy theory that you guys, you Freemasons are, running the show, apparently. You guys are the cabal behind it all. And
really
stop me if I'm mistaken, but aren't the Shriners, the guys in the little cars, also part of the Freemasons, or is that something different and I'm getting confused?
I mean, it's all kind of under the same umbrella for what we do, but we're not so much associated with them. As you say, we're somewhat grouped together, but they're not really the same. So there is a difference. But going back to what I was saying, so the genuine secrets of a Master Mason were lost. They were lost when Hiram Abiff was killed. Now, because we've had to make secrets basically to hold our society together, those secrets can be found easily with a Google search. I promise you, there's nothing you cannot find on Google about Freemasonry.
Wow. So that's the modern world there.
That's the modern world. You can look up the modern secrets easily, without a doubt. But the original secret that was predicated on the whole thing, completely lost. Totally lost. No one has any idea. So it's kind of a matter of, as you say, we've lost that information. It's something lost to time that we're never likely to find again, because at the time it wasn't written down, as it was such a closely guarded secret. It was never written, inscribed, carved, anything. It died literally with Hiram Abiff. So, I mean, that's that. We're just never going to find out. So we've had to build something off of it. And
well, and I guess that's the thing, right? Because you guys at least know that there was knowledge that was lost, but in many cases, the lost knowledge is just lost knowledge, and until and unless someone finds it, it's unknowable.
Exactly.
And that's assuming it was written somewhere and put in a pot and put in a cave, or lost on a hard drive under someone's bed, or that it is in fact discoverable, which, as your example highlights, it is not. There is no discoverability behind what has been lost.
No, I mean, there was talk that it was possibly stored in one of the lower parts of King Solomon's temple, but as that no longer exists, it's it's kind of difficult to find. So we've had to substitute it. But really, when you get down to it, the Freemasons are only really held together by what we do. Primarily, we are a charity. And yes, there are religious connotations. There are things I think even you would really find interesting. So if you ever get invited to a Freemasons lodge, please go. Even if you decide not to join, it is fantastically interesting. I think you'd really enjoy it.
I've learned a lot already, and I've learned that I could learn a lot more if I want to. So that's a great place to start. I want to ask, we're just about at our time here, but I want to ask one final sort of meta question of Jacob, that we're talking about forbidden knowledge, and we've sort of been talking about, our modern time like it's immune to that, right? That if something's on the internet, we think of it as there forever. But websites die, the Wayback Machine doesn't catch everything. And, if our society collapses, are our hard drives particularly good for storing information? Or is all this information that we love so much actually more likely to be lost to the ages than a piece of papyrus might be? Do we have any indication of that, Jacob?
Nothing is permanent, and neither is the internet. I think that the fact of the matter is that so much of the information we have is not just stored in devices, but also on an infrastructure that is required to make use of it all.
Like electricity, for instance, can't do much without that.
And at a certain point, it's less about what happens to your sources and more about what happens to your library, because the systems we have that allow us to access information have many ways they can fail. They've failed in the past because people have systematically cracked down on those who know how to use systems of information, or they have, languages and methods of reading have been lost to time and eventually sometimes been redeciphered and sometimes not. So I would caution against the idea that any information is unsalvageable, unless I suppose we mean the information in a physics sense. But even then, we have the information paradox around black holes. So,
thank goodness for the information paradox around black holes. That's what I always say.
I think that even today, the ability to remove information on a large scale is demonstrated. For example, none of us have brought up the Great Firewall of China.
That's a big one.
The system, the People's Republic of China, and to an even more extreme degree, that North Korea also has in place for limiting what sorts of information can be accessed online. This has involved creating essentially an entire web infrastructure that is far more centralized and easier to monitor. Versions of websites that we're familiar with in countries like the United States and the member states of the European Union, like Google, will have equivalencies there like Baidu that can be monitored very directly. Now, you can get around the Great Firewall. When I was in China for an extended period of time,
VPNs have become pretty popular, right?
Yeah, you can use VPNs. They're officially illegal, but what are they going to do? Everyone, or like all the young people, have them. But even then, the effort and know-how and whatnot to use those means that the number of people who are going to be using them are simply smaller than the population at large. Now, you can think of what might happen over a long enough period of time if there weren't active forces trying to open up to the outside world, which there are in this case, in our modern world. I hesitate to say that, for a certain number of people in society, I think that the fact of the matter is that modern states can censor things very well. In an absolute sense, maybe not, but I don't think it's ever really been absolute in the past. It's just about how you concentrate power and how long you keep it concentrated that allows these things to work. So I wouldn't put it past the modern and future forces to remove information from the present. The internet might be extensive, but the written word was also a more extensive way of keeping things in the oral tradition when it came around, and we've still lost parts of it.
Yeah, well, I think that's a good place to leave it. That appreciate what you have, because you may not always have it. That our information isn't, we think of it as being safe, as backed up to the cloud or whatever. But maybe you want to write it down, or at least print it out. But yeah, thank you for everyone joining us in this conversation about banned books and forbidden knowledge. I know we only scratched on the surface. So we can definitely come back to this in the future, maybe with a more specific focus. I think we got a good sampling of the discussion. And thank you, Jacob, for mentioning the Great Firewall of China as well. This has been the Dank Christian Memes podcast. Our music is provided by Olive Tiger. Our next recording session is Sunday at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. Dank Christian Memes is a place for all kinds of Christians and all kinds of non-Christians to enjoy silly memes together, as well as this podcast occasionally. If you would like to connect with our community further, there's a link to our Discord in the comments section. Thank you for listening, and until next time, may the memes bless you and keep you.